All right, we might get started. Welcome everyone. I'm kind of spinning my chair so I get to look at you, the wonderful people who are online and also those who are joining us in person. I'm Caroline Lynette, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion. So a special welcome to our colleagues from Canada who are joining us on Thursday late afternoon/evening. So welcome, special welcome to you. So tomorrow, the 14th of October, Australians will vote in the Voice referendum. It is a yes or no vote to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. We are asking this question in 2023. Whatever the outcome for tomorrow's vote, the lead-up has been especially difficult and bruising for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, who are the rightful owners of this land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the land was stolen through violent means. There was no consent, no treaty, and no compensation. And as an uninvited migrant settler who lives and works on Bedigal land where I am today, and who benefits from the very institutions that continue to dispossess and oppress Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I recognise my privileges and my complicity with those systems, something we must continue to recognise and challenge. I respond to the call of First Nations scholars from around the world who have asked us not to use acknowledgement of country as a tokenistic or performative gesture if we are not prepared to do the work. I'm thinking here of Joseph Pearce, who is a First Nations scholar in the United States and who's written an excellent blog post called "Your Land Acknowledgement is Not Enough." I also want to mention that on the international scene, we are witnessing in real time colonial violence and settler-colonial solidarity. I acknowledge the pain, the distress, and the suffering that is being seen, as well as the pain, distress, and suffering that is not being seen. The use of the word decolonisation for this panel was intentional, but I must begin by challenging that word. We know that in academia especially, decolonisation has been co-opted as a metaphor, and it's used to signify anything and everything that needs to change. The initial meaning of the term, including here in Australia, is about self-determination and returning land to Indigenous people. So I don't want to contribute to weakening or diluting the emancipatory nature of the word decolonisation. So when it's not about returning land, we should speak of anti-colonial work. The leadership of Max Liboiron, who is a First Nations scholar in Canada, has been very useful in confirming how much this shift is needed. So we come together to discuss the topic of suicide with this anti-colonial framing to guide us. So the way that we are going to run this session, we're going to first start with a poem, and then I'm going to ask a question to each of our speakers, and they're going to have between 8 and 10 minutes to respond. And towards the end, hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But I love beginning with a poem because I think it grounds us in the topic. And so I'm going to invite my wonderful colleague, co-author and extraordinary poet to share her writing with us. Joel, over to you.
Hi everyone, I hope you guys are all having a wonderful morning. My name is Achol Juk. I am South Sudanese. I have been writing for about 2 years, seriously for 2 years now. My poetry usually explore themes of identity, battling two cultures. Mental health is a theme that's I'm always writing about. And so today's poem, it's called Escaped. Here we go. Awaken and spiraling with my skull in fragments, hung over in the corner of my mind, spirits loom on shelves. Rum and Scott deep pressed against my groin, soaking in wine, I groan. Why am I by? Paula grazed my thigh as PTSD escaped my trembling womb. Schizophrenia passively stained my quilt as my sedated tongue muzzled the whispers. A surge of blood tore my cochlea. My lungs embraced the aroma of poppy seed bagels. In a field of opium, by suicide, I bathed in saline. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Joel. That's amazing, amazing writing, and thank you for writing it for this occasion and for sharing it with us to get us started on our conversation. It's really special to be able to do that. I would now like to invite Jennifer to introduce yourself, and Jennifer, here's a bit of a prompt. Can you tell us what you think needs to change about suicide research? So what do we need to do differently, and why do we need critical suicide studies?
Sure. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you for inviting me. It's just such a pleasure to be in the company of some very smart, wise thinkers and poets. And so, Ichol, thank you for starting us off with your poem. It was very powerful. Your words landed deeply, so thank you for that. My name's Jennifer White, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and the Esquimalt Nations, also known as Victoria, BC, Canada. And Carolyn, I very much appreciated your way of beginning because, of course, I think we need to move beyond sterile scripted statements of territorial acknowledgements, and I agree that they're insufficient. And I want to add to what you've already said in terms of positioning myself as a white settler scholar, working in a colonial institution like a university, thinking about the ways that I benefit from the dispossession of the First Peoples of these lands, and the ways that I have responsibilities to not only push for the sovereignty and self-determination of First Nations people, but to speak up against anti-Indigenous racism, and the ways in which many white people like myself continue to be blind and ignorant, and deliberately so, about the colonial reality here in Canada, and I think similarly in Australia. So with that, I just want to again say how delighted I am to be with you here today, and to say again how seriously I take my responsibilities as a white settler, and I'm very alert to the possibility for co-optation of these kinds of statements, that they become empty slogans in some ways. And so I'm always looking for new ways to continue to extend this, so that we're in conversation in a more meaningful way, as opposed to a checkbox that we just have to click off before we get on to the work. So with that said, I loved the question that you invited me to think with, and I'll really be interested to be in conversation with Jeffrey and with Marianne and Ichol about some of these things. So there's a great quote from the very late Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking that I think perfectly answers the question of why we need critical suicide studies. And he wrote, "We need shaking up because suicide is encumbered with so many conceptual taboos that we do not know how to think it." And I find that such a helpful way to begin, because it reminds me that we've inherited ways for thinking about suicide that are deeply freighted with certain understandings of what counts as knowledge, what counts as selves, what do we even think about suicide itself. We immediately, I think, conjure up ideas that it's undesirable, that it's something that should be stopped and controlled. It's something that we should be intervening upon. And so I want to take a little bit of time now in the next, kind of 8 minutes or so to just unpack some of my own thinking about critical suicide studies, because this is an area that I've been very vested in, I would say, over the last 15 years, to think otherwise about suicide. And some of you may not have even heard that there's such a thing called critical suicide studies. So I want to take a little bit of time to elaborate about how critical suicide studies has emerged, where I sort of see it heading, and some of the ways that it responds to this question of why we might need it, and particularly why we might need it now more than ever. I think the biggest, most compelling answer about why we need another approach is because what we're doing isn't working. So I think we have lots of evidence to show over the decades that despite all of the money and all of the research and all of the investment in suicide prevention programs, that suicide rates stubbornly persist, particularly in the global north and in many Western nations. And so that's, I think, an important rationale to say why might we need to look for alternatives. And I think, as I sort of alluded to, we've inherited this kind of standard or mainstream way of thinking about suicide that's very much grounded in an understanding of suicide being an individual act. It's often thought about in very decontextualized, depoliticized ways. And we have often been given ways of thinking about it that's very biomedical in its framing. And I think what Ian Marsh, our colleague, who's written a fantastic book, if you haven't read it before, he talks about suicide being linked to pathology in this way. So he talks about a compulsory ontology of pathology. In other words, it's saying to be suicidal is to be pathological. And to be pathologized. And I think this is one of these things that we want to trouble and interrupt and think otherwise about, whether that's a useful frame. And certainly we know historically it hasn't been the only frame for thinking about suicide. We know at other times in history, suicide's been thought about as a crime. Sometimes it's been thought about as a sin. We're in an era of time right now where we think about it as a mental illness. But what that does is it points to its historical contingency over time, that it's not something stable that just sits in a vacuum. And so how we think about it matters. I think that we have been dominated by assumptions about suicide that liken it often to a medical problem. Sometimes we see campaigns saying it's just like diabetes, it's just like heart disease. And the minute we start going to those kind of analogies, we start thinking again in individualized terms, that this is a static phenomenon, that we just need to find the right risk factors, and then we can intervene upon persons. And that's sort of where that kind of thinking goes when we start likening it to a disease. Suicidology itself is very dominated by positivist research methodologies, where there's kind of a lot of cause-effect reasoning. We, I think, are all pretty familiar with the notion of evidence-based practice being grounded in a quite narrow range of methodologies. Quantitative research certainly still dominates in the mainstream field of suicidology. And what that means is other forms of knowledge are typically disqualified. So the knowledge that comes from people with lived experience of suicide, the knowledge of people who have lost a loved one to suicide. And we certainly know that because the suicide rates and the ways that we've been working towards addressing it are not really taking us in a necessarily a hopeful direction, that's all the more reason to open up new ways of thinking about it, and allowing other methodologies and other ways of thinking about it to proliferate. And so I think one of the consequences of inheriting this biomedical individualizing framework on suicide is that the solutions that we are faced with, typically in a clinical context, focus very much on individual risk management, risk assessments. Sometimes it involves containment or surveillance of people to control their suicidality. We also, I think, are faced often with expert-driven responses that also disqualify the role of community and relationality and other ways that people might be supported to consider a different kind of livable life. So these are just some of the consequences, I think, of inheriting this individualized framework for thinking about suicide. And I just might wrap up my time because I definitely want to hear from everybody else, is some of the effects of these ways of thinking is that it really contributes to a kind of saving life at any cost mentality, which could actually be harmful to people if they're being contained against their will, for example, or under surveillance, where they have a loss of autonomy. Alexandra Burrill has written a brilliant book called Suicidism that kind of addresses some of this from a really interesting perspective. And it reduces human experience to risk factors, which I think is quite problematic. It erases the socio-political contexts that produce distress and suffering by only focusing on individuals in a decontextualized ways. And I argue that it really limits the possibilities for collective actions that are aimed at addressing social adversities or creating worlds worth living in. So to get at the other question you asked about what we might do differently, or what critical suicide studies might offer, I think there's some alternative questions we might ask, both as researchers and as practitioners and as educators, that get at a bit more of this nuance and context for how suicide emerges, that pays attention to the politics. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of questions I'm imagining. So what kind of world gives rise to the quote unquote choice of suicide? That gives us a different focus. How can we reimagine suicide prevention as a set of collective ethical and relational possibilities, as opposed to an individual intervention that's acting upon a person who's designated as an at-risk person? And if suicide were to be reconceptualized as a political issue and a public trouble, what new collectivities and social actions might emerge? And finally, how can we create more livable and hospitable worlds for all? So I'll leave it at that, and then I'll pass it back to you, Caroline, and I'll listen closely for the others. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't know how you summarize all this wealth of knowledge so succinctly in the little time that you had, but it's an amazing introduction to the conversation, and it's already given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much. Jeffrey, I'd now like to ask you to share your contribution on what you think the sociocultural, political, and environmental dimensions of suicide we need to better understand. And by doing so, can you share with us what models work in First Nations communities in Canada? Thank you.
Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to this wonderful group of people. It's really a real honor to be here, and thank you also to Jennifer for your wonderful way of getting us rolling here. It's I promise you all, Jennifer is a tough act to follow. But I do want to just begin by acknowledging country. I've spent the last year and a half of my life actually in Australia, in Noongar territory, in Perth in Western Australia, a region that is deeply impacted by the mining industrial complex that also impacts the same territory I find myself on today in Algonquin lands in Northern Ontario. I learned so much in my time in your country, a time of the build-up to the referendum. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is an invitation to walk together. And I think if I could vote in your election, I would be voting yes, for recognition, for treaty. But moreover, I raised this also today, thinking about our responsibilities as Indigenous scholars and as anti-colonial scholars in solidarity with Palestinians and all who suffer under occupation around the world. That occupation is a crime. And it means something very peculiar in our time to work as researchers and educators in the days of our kind of resurgent fascism all around the world. The questions we ask now are more important than ever for creating the kinds of livable worlds that Jennifer was just speaking of. So yeah, I pay my respects to your elders where you are, past and present and emerging. I'm grateful for the learning that you've shared with me in this last year, and hope that some of my words can be of use to you. But really thinking in the context that you're working working in. I also encourage you to read the works of folks like Pat Dudgeon, and many others in your context, Helen Milroy, and so many others doing important work in suicide prevention in First Nations across Australia and the Torres Strait Islands. An elder in North America, widely considered a kind of prophetic speaker in our traditions, Edward Benton Benai, once said that we have to know the wound, not so that we endlessly study damage, but so that we know how and where to act. For me, this is at the heart of better, more ethical, and more deeply politicized responses to suicide in Indigenous communities. For the better part of 50 years of Canadian history, you can go all the way back into our media archives and see some of the first examples of when sort of contagion or clustered examples of suicides were occurring in First Nations. And from the beginning, it's been labeled as Jennifer alluded to, pathologized, irrational, and profoundly depoliticized in its meaning often. Often first framed as a failure to adapt to modernity, later framed as the product of mental illness, more recently framed as the product of internal relational breakdown in Indigenous people, further pathologizing our communities that have suffered in the wake of colonial policies that have directly targeted families. And so over the last 6 years, really, in my career, I began to think and rethink about some of the social and political bases of the disproportionate rate of suicide in Indigenous communities in Canada and elsewhere around the world. And I think there's a number of studies in Indigenous health in recent years that have highlighted the fact that colonialism is the most frequently cited ideological factor that is most cited in relationship to suicide in Indigenous communities, and in fact in all health issues impacting Indigenous people, but that we often lack specificity in describing how mechanisms of colonialism actively play out and have affective consequence on people. How does the fact of 500 years of colonial and imperialist intervention on these lands actually come to make me or my kin feel deadly, feel the lethal affects, the annihilating affects of colonial power? And so my attention has turned to the material. It's moved away in recent years from maybe more anthropological conversations about Indigenous cultural identity towards actually really attending to the ways that this event, or not event, this structure of colonialism has come to permeate and materially segregate Indigenous life. And looking at that in ways that really get us to concretely how it might feel to grow up in an apartheid world, where in Canada, Indigenous children from the time they are born to the time they are adults receive around 65 cents to the dollar in public funding for health, education, and social services. Or what it might feel like to live in a food desert, or what it might feel like to be parched, quite literally parched for justice as it relates to water security, or what it might mean to live in a place that your community has been forcibly relocated to, where the government never built permanent housing, and where you are not authorized to build housing without the government's consent. These are not just irrelevant factors. These are central factors that structure affective life and the possibilities of living. And so for me, my attention is beginning to really focus not on just documenting these further evidences of social inequalities, but to better understand how social inequalities feel. And for that, I've really turned to the work of Indigenous feminist scholars who offer us understandings of affect that really begin to drive home our need for dealing with, in more explicit ways, these political and ecological dimensions. And I'll give you one example from a community in Canada in Northern Ontario, where I currently am working in is a community called Niskandiga. Niskandiga is a First Nation that has been without clean drinking water for 23 years. It has been cited by UN special rapporteurs. It's been subject to multiple failures by the federal and provincial government to remediate water. But it's also a community in Ontario that has one of the highest rates of suicide in Canada. And in a recent kind of example of this, the community is essentially required to seek clean drinking water, not unsimilar to what's happening in places in the Kimberleys, through reverse osmosis systems that have been temporarily installed in the middle of shacks in the middle of town. This is a location where young people in this community are choosing to die. It's also the place where the community continues to collect water each day, being reminded of these deaths. I think about this as a very jarring and unsettling, but revealing political dimension of Indigenous people's health in this community. A community that has failed to have water remediated for over 23 years is a community where young people could grow up with a very real sense that their inherent dignity and worth has been fundamentally questioned by the state that's supposed to protect them. And then to ask these young people to not feel suicidal, I think is a profound perversity. So what works in Indigenous suicide prevention in Canada is a very complex question, as it is in Australia and Aotearoa and anywhere in the world living under the shadow of empire. However, what I can say is that the places where we see promise, the places where we see examples of possibility in suicide prevention are actually places that are concerned with bettering the material conditions for living. Places where communities have enacted their determination as self-governing nations to bring control to their systems of education, public services, social services, even public safety and water governance. These are places where promote health, like access to food, water, safe housing, livable incomes are being ensured. And these are also places where the goal of those who are invested in suicide prevention is not merely the mitigation of the risk of death, but is a deeper and more fundamental commitment to the promotion and enhancement of Indigenous people's lives. I think this is a radically important shift that many young people in Canada have really ushered into our thinking, and the work of folks like Jennifer White and Ed Connors and their work on life promotion, wise practices in life promotion has also stimulate further. But this idea that to prevent suicide, we need a broader vision of justice, one that is not merely about ensuring that by any means necessary, even if it's carceral, that we reduce the possibility of dying, but instead ask ourselves the question of what are the conditions that communities need at the very basis to live, and moreover, to thrive. And for that, the sociocultural becomes very important because our ideas about good living come from our culture. They come from our stories, our teachings, our lore, our ways of understanding life. And so I think about this as it relates to my work on the environment, that our people teach us that violence on the land is violence on the body. And Australian teachers have taught me that when country is healthy, we are healthy. And so when I think increasingly about conditions of livability and the prevention of suicide, I think that has to be tethered to multi-scalar projects that are invested in the livability of our planet, in the livability of our land and water, and that remind us that the wounds on land are connected to the wounds on our body. The suffering of land is connected to the suffering of one another. Practically speaking, there are steps that communities can take to enhance their self-determination, but that will inevitably be a political struggle. And so my work in the next 5 years is turning to 3 directions that I see as promising practices that help us get to the collective work that Jennifer was speaking of. And that is, I'm studying the work of direct action the ways that communities are using things from hunger striking to die-ins in parliament to graffiti on city walls that document the suicide notes and demands of Indigenous young people to act on these political inequalities, as one way that we are politically enlivening the struggle for life. The other is looking at socio-legal advocacy. First Nations across Canada are engaged in class action lawsuits against our government to draw attention to the human rights violations that are implicated in suicide inequalities. This is another promising direction that helps begin us to collectivize and bring accountability at the level of our governments to generations of inaction. And then finally, I'm looking towards abolitionist practices and anarchist practices of harm reduction and the ways that not only traditions of peer support, but radically de-professionalized spaces of care, where people seek support through peer support, through safe houses, through networks that are attentive to issues of security, culture, and surveillance, where people who are actively suicidal can sit with one another and can sit with people who care about them, but who are not going to call the cops. These are other promising places that are particularly important to Indigenous peoples in Canada who are disproportionately murdered by police across the country. And so those are maybe more radically unexpected spaces to talk about suicide prevention. But frankly, as my dear colleague and friend Jennifer has alluded to, the spaces that we've been invested in for decades aren't working. And so maybe I'll pause there and look forward to your questions and conversation with each other.
Thank you so much. I must admit, I'm really struggling between the temptation to know more and ask questions and moving the panel along, but this is just because it's so interesting and so important, everything that you've just shared with us, so I really appreciate that. Thank you. Marianne, I'd like to bring you in now, and if you would like to share with us your knowledge based on your work with different communities around this topic, and if you can share with us what still needs to change in the Australian context.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, everybody. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the land on which I'm coming to you from today, Turrbal and the Yagara people in the land of Meanjin, where I was born. I'd also like to pay my respects to my maternal lineage, stolen generation. And I refer to my colleagues here and the beautiful framing of the situation we find ourselves with here in Australia at the moment. And I want to pay respects to my maternal lineage because it's that story of 5 generations that a white man took one of my ancestors and sired a child, is how the paperwork refers to it. And this legacy rolled on for 5 generations until it stopped with me. And I made at first an unconscious decision and then a very conscious decision not to have children, to stop that ongoing cycle that resulted in our children being stolen within my family. So what we're voting for tomorrow in relation to finding a voice for that, I think really is the premise of what my work is all about. And that has started in a very deep and personal search to find reconciliation for myself. So when I was, my birth mother was removed from country, just as her mother had, and her mother before her. She was brought down to Brisbane to a home for unmarried mothers. And I was born directly into the care of the Department of Social Services, with the colonial idea that I would be assimilated directly into Western culture. I can say that didn't work to the point that I feel now I have like a spiritual anaphylaxis to aspects of Western culture that have been incredibly helpful for me in relation to my own reconciliation, but also in relation to the people I work with, because it takes the premise away from that there's something wrong with me to what happened to me that I need to reconcile. And Jennifer and Jeffrey, you both beautifully alluded to the wound, the private wound, and Ecole, your poem describes just the depth and breadth of what that wounding can feel like. I could not be more grateful for the academics that, particularly in the last few years, I've been embraced by. There are some in this room today, because for me, working at the coalface of birth and death as an Indigenous midwife, I didn't have time to write papers, and I didn't have time to read them either. With no disrespect to anybody here, because I've read a lot of this, the literature that is relevant, and it is extraordinary. But from the point of view at the coalface, working with birth and death, what qualified me to step into that place is, for the longest time in my life, every day I got up and struggled with the idea of whether I wanted to be here or not. And I worked within the mental health system, so it wasn't an obvious choice for me to seek help in the system that every day I fought against the abuses and injustices that they were perpetrating on our most vulnerable. So I needed to find a way to understand why I couldn't tolerate this apparently privileged culture. And again, working at the interface of birth and death gave me incredible insight into that, because when people are about to birth or about to die, a lot of the things that we think are so important suddenly become hugely irrelevant. And understanding how to stay in that tension with people helped me to work with mostly our younger mob, but not always. I worked with people across the lifespan that I had the capacity to listen to so deeply, that they would relax into a space where they felt that they could share something as vulnerable as, I don't think I can be here anymore. And I never took it on as a pathology, a crime, or a sin. To me, it was the most exquisite place to enter with somebody, because it called out in me my cultural responsibilities as an Indigenous midwife to lead people from the familiar and what they need to die to into the unfamiliar. Now, that's difficult for even the most privileged of us. Believe me, I've supported them. But for the most underprivileged, to try and guide them into a place that previously there is no imagery or felt experience other than terror and suffering, is really when it's game on. And it takes time, commitment, and a community and cultural response. So we've lost so many of our young people, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, and everything up, that at that young age have already decided that it's too difficult. I was never able to get in front and help that. And that's been a huge regret in my life when I've looked back and seen some of the signs that we missed. But what we did do in reviewing that, and reviewing why somebody as young as 9 years old would take their life, led me into a deep and profound exploration of the perinatal, and just how we've corrupted that meticulous space, and how now our young people are imprinted to die through memories of trauma that actually prohibit them from understanding they are so close to transition and making it through to the other side with an expanded state of well-being, which is our birthright. So I approach suicide not from pathology, but from remembering and reconciling. It was an integral part of initiation. If you weren't ready to die, then you weren't ready to change at the magnitude that's required at birth and death, and that should be respected. But for those who are willing to take their life, who are putting out that call, and we brutalize them, we pathologize them, we ignore, isolate, and disrespect them, that is now intolerable. We know better. We need to do better. So what I'm asking of you all today is to consider the perinatal, the invisible realms of the perinatal. Nobody's standing up and talking about what the fetus's experience is like there. But I will briefly today. I was conceived by 2 teenage adults who were drunk and had no intention of siring a child. So I lived from the moment of conception in a space where I wasn't wanted. In fact, my mother had 2 attempted abortion. So I lived with the physiology that death was something that I yearned for and seeked for, and would offer me some sense of relief. And it was unpacking that tension that has allowed me to step into life in a way that truly appreciates us for our magnificence, not for our limitations, and the fact that we're recovering from trauma. I see who we are on the other side. And my primary intention now, to the best of my ability, one person at a time, is to do what I can to help people remember we are magnificent beyond our wildest dreams. That if you're wanting to die, you're wanting to die because there is so much trauma. You're at the forefront of a spiritual crisis. And if you are midwifed from that space, you will step into a new way of being that will be truly extraordinary. And the more individuals we can bring through to the other side, into the depth and breadth of their unique creative genius, the faster we'll resolve this issue. So my perspective isn't to diminish anybody else. Like, I've been calling out in the wild for a long time without people listening. But I'm saying I need each of you to step up and consider the position of the most vulnerable. Our fetuses, our children, our newborn, our elderly, our most precious resources, and to start to reflect on how we create a safe environment for people to lean into change and appreciate what's on the other side. We need some really critical thinking about what happens when you have a breakthrough. If you go back to what you've created before, do you just want to die again? If you can break through and be held, celebrated, as our Indigenous people across the world have done for millennia, then we are truly creating a new paradigm.
Thank you, Marianne. I was just checking if you wanted to end there for now. Are you happy to? Or do you want to add? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was still taken in what you were saying and writing notes. Thank you. That's an incredible point to take us through with what we've already heard, and some really concrete content for us to take on board and to reflect on. Thank you, Marianne. I just wanted to point out that part of the reason why this workshop came about is because of me meeting Achol and working alongside her. So at this point, Achol, I wanted to bring you back into the discussion for you to share your perspectives on what you are doing in your community, and if you can share with us how we should think about the topic of suicide and the lived experience of suicide from your experience, and what you've seen, what you are seeing happening at the moment.
My community has a reputation of never speaking about anything to do with mental health at all. And so when us first generation Australians, or the ones that are living in the Western countries, when we have issues that we want to talk about or just bring to the forefront of what is going on, usually the elders in our communities will, one, shut it down. Two, it's always, mental health is always associated with witchcraft. They always look for to blame others instead of actually sitting down and realizing that the trauma that our parents carry have been passed down to us. And it's just never anything that they want to acknowledge. And so I think like the past couple of years, suicide rates have tremendously like gone up in the Sudanese community. I'm sure in the all the African communities do experience suicide, but I think in South Sudan, suicide rates have skyrocketed. And I think the reason for that is that we don't feel supported. Our parents are not there. And so when we see people from other cultures having the support of their parents, and we come home and we want that support, we don't get it. And so most of us have no options but to end our lives just so that we have relief and we just do not continue suffering at all. But for some of us who are very fortunate to discover a way of dealing with mental health, for example, myself, writing has been something that has really, really helped me come to terms with my emotions. And so poetry for me has been a tool that I've used to convey complex emotions, experiences, and my perspective. And so it's been a valuable tool for raising awareness and fostering dialogues, especially among the young people. I've also realized that poetry can be used to, poetry is a form of storytelling and expression. And if communities really do come together, this could encourage them, and especially survivors that are affected by suicide, to express their feelings and experiences, which for a lot of them, I think it's kind of difficult. And so what I realized as well is that poetry, for me, it's for us that do not like to directly speak about mental health. Poetry is a tool that you could kind of dance around with what you are trying to say. You don't directly have to say, I'm feeling very suicidal. There's ways that you could use to express yourself. And so I think that it's something that we could all use. And it's a great way to start like a dialogue within refugee communities. And it also fosters sympathy, because a lot of people can relate to the story that I'm telling. And also, because I write in like third person and second person, I often feel very removed from the situation or the experiences that I'm trying to convey. And so I find that I'm actually expressing myself, but because I'm writing in third person, I'm basically removed from the experiences. And so poetry is a great way to really start dialogue within the refugee and migrant communities. Especially because a lot of them will relate to the experiences that are being written and being shared.
Super, thank you so much. That's really important, and for us to hear that and to hear your perspectives about how poetry has been helpful to you and can perhaps be helpful for others. My head is full of ideas and things that I want to discuss further, but I would like to invite everyone who's spoken to come back into the conversation and perhaps for 2-3 minutes each respond to what other speakers have said. I think this is an amazing learning journey for all of us from very different perspectives. And so I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are on what we've just shared. Jennifer, perhaps I'll go back to you first, if that's okay, if you would like to share.
Sure. I'll definitely be happy to offer some reflections. There's so much rich, loving, tender thoughts here that I want to engage with. And I guess the through line for me right at this moment is this place of language and metaphor and poetry, and even midwifery as a metaphor for witnessing the contradictions that I think we're speaking about a lot here, life and death, and wanting to die, but not always, sometimes wanting to live. And I think the language of suicide we've inherited to think with is so impoverished. And I think that's when we turn to poetry and we turn to metaphor. And I love that each of us, I think, are speaking about diverse ways of knowing and diverse representations, not just of suicide, but how we might come at it. And Jeffrey, the examples you gave about radical action and die-ins and graffiti and bringing, you know, this idea of radical networks of care. I mean, that to me feels life-giving. I just am filled with hope and possibility that if we continue to allow these diverse ways of thinking about the issue and draw on knowledge from those who have lived experience, and in this kind of, I don't know, revolutionary way that gets us out of one way of thinking that we all agree can actually be quite harmful and has been harmful to people who have been suicidal. And so I think I'll just end with that this kind of way of using language to revolutionize and transform in both material ways, as Jeffrey's calling for, and in relational ways that come back to our birthright as sparklingly magnificent, as Marianne has sort of talked about it. So that's just my immediate reflection. So thank you all. It's just beautiful conversation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jeffrey?
Wow, I mean, I think it's been delightful hearing all your perspectives. I'm really struck by this this important reflection that you made, Marianne, about that our traditions as Indigenous people, and I think I should have said where my family comes from is a community called Fisher River Cree Nation. We're a Cree Nation in the center of Canada. But you said something that's just really echoing in my mind since you said the words, was about that, like, these the confronting death is an important moment of transition, and that just really resonated with me, because I think there's been for such a long time in suicide prevention this assumption that people that are suicidal have lost the capacity to see themselves into the future, and my experience is that that's a lie, but that more often than not they haven't been asked good questions about their hopes, their sense of belonging in the world, their aspirations, and more importantly, what these questions about death, what these desires, these attachments or lack of attachments to the world signal about the spiritual question that's in front of them, the spiritual struggle. I often talk about living these days as a struggle against annihilation, that for me and for many in the world, the project of living is a bold one. I think whether I mean, Achal, you were speaking to like the experience of generations of people that have experienced conflict or migration or moving to a new part of the world. These are profoundly impacting life experiences, and the challenge of living within them is ultimately a question of like the kind of lives, the kind of meaning, the kind of purpose that we discover for ourselves, and not just for ourselves but with one another, and that I think is the word spiritual often has so much baggage for colonial minds, but I think if we understand it as a deeply grounded and relational word that invites questions of meaning, purpose, belonging, and hope, to me, suicide and feeling suicidal can be a profound opening to living a deeply vibrant life. So just, I think, having deeper respect and regard and appreciation for the dignity of people's stories and what gets them into these moments, and holding space for that sort of sacred spiritual piece is like just deep. That's a beautiful well to draw from, and I'm really grateful to all of you here, and it gets at the core of that idea about worlds worth living in. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Marianne, would you like to add anything and respond to what's just been shared?
I'd like to express my appreciation again. Anything that Carolyn's involved in, I know she will draw out the most extraordinary minds and people. But it's the depth of heart in this conversation. It's the capacity to hold the tension between critical thinking and the heart, the deep appreciation of the felt experience of what it's like to live through atrocities and what can we learn from people who can weave that suffering into the elegant language of poetry or music that allows it to be more digestible. But it's the bold use of spirituality in a reframed context that I love. And I would gently offer again, as a midwife whose work is located in the death rebirth journey. So death, rebirth, where so often we want to skip through the death part and just grab the rebirth, which in Western culture keeps us looping back to the non. So again, at this time where we've become so divisive, it has me reflecting on what's happened in Western culture to birth, when women were deemed powerless and laid on their back and pushed against gravity to birth their children. We have created this new split in the psyche, which has us, even the very best of us, struggling or fighting to survive. And I think the most powerful work I do with the most vulnerable is being able to gently sit in that space with them and go, what if we just stopped struggling? What if in this space we listen deeply to those who are right at the frontier of transformation, who feel like they have no choice either to stay here or to go? If we could learn to support in that place, to hold that tension and to hold hope for people in that place where there is no hope, but gently lead them to the horizon and go, but just on the other side, you will be held and received in a way that you will deeply remember, but you have currently forgot. And that needs to be a cultural response. Michael Anderson, brilliant Aboriginal man, reminded us that no Aboriginal child is ever born without a parent. So those of us who didn't have children or take on the responsibility of others' children, ensure that everybody is held, that nobody is left alone or with that feeling of not belonging. This conversation today is steeped in that deep, deep understanding. And I couldn't be more grateful to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Joel, would you like to add anything?
I just want to express my appreciation to the amazing minds in the rooms. It's very comforting knowing that there are people out there trying to combat suicide and mental health in general, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities. I would like to read another poem just to end on not so good note, but a good note. The title of this poem is I Can't Talk to My Sudanese Parents. I think I should change it to like ethnic parents, because we'll all stem from the same mentality and the same way of life. But at the start of every conversation, aggression flares in your eyes and I inhaled your trauma. When will you try, Ma? Enslaved to your toxicity, poisonous words dance at the tip of your tongue while apologies hide in your palate. Swatting my emotions, the walls in my room quiver. As my silent screams awaken the dead, shield with paranoia, the stench of neglect woos from the strands of my hair. Heir to your throne, I'd carry bags filled with silence. Listen to the songs of your broken child. Stalked by schizophrenia, I draw skits in my mind's arena, nursing my pronouns and sleeping with bottles I can't even pronounce. Cocaine's laced with placebo. I console the voices in my head. I'm afraid I will not rise with the sun, yet you believe I have no reason to die young. Ma, as you marry your beliefs, marry our pray too, for a merry day. And that's it.
Thank you so much.